Hi, and thank you for tuning in to a new episode about the Japanese SEF uniforms and unique airsoft. Before we begin, I want to thank people who have subscribed in the last few days. Thank you very much. So I really know that you like this kind of stuff that I'm doing. And in my last 3 videos, I saw you like the Japanese Armed Forces videos, so I'm going to do a lot more of it. In this video, we're going to talk about the early stages about the Japanese Self-Defense Force unit. But unfortunately, because there's not much footage or image from the Self-Defense Force at that time, it will maybe be a short video, but that's why I will edit it. Also the olive green uniform, the Type 65 uniform, and sort of a copy of the original World War II leftover uniforms from 1943. So without further ado, let's start. After World War II in 1945 finally ended, the Japanese Imperial Army, Ground Army, Air Force and the Imperial Navy was dissolved. Japan had no longer an standard army, and all weaponry and weapon equipment from the Japanese armed forces has to be given to the Americans and the British occupation forces to prevent the uprising from other commanders or leftover from command that they want to continue the war. In the first 5 years, Japan took a slowly recovery, but even Japan did not have an armed forces anymore. They still had to have trained some police forces in the early 1950s. When 1950 started, the Korean War broke out between North Korea, the communist North, and the capitalist South Korea. Capitalist South Korea was ill-equipped to even make the proper defense. North Korea was good prepared for an attack and making big advancement. 3 years struck the Korean peninsula, and when the war was finally over in the year 1953, an armistice was signed, but there is no peace ever evolved in that area. So after the Korean War, the American government decided to allow Japan to have a police force. It was called the Japan Self-Defense Force. So for the Navy, Air Force and Ground Forces. We're only going to concentrate about the ground forces and their equipment. The first webbing equipment and uniforms were left over from World War II. Because the Japanese soldier was a little bit smaller than the US soldier, for example, so it added some adjustments to make them fit right. They were given standard M1 Garands, M2 carbines as standard weapons for the infantry, light machine guns, the M1919 light machine gun, the Browning 1919 or 1918 I mean, the Browning light machine gun, and other variation of weaponry. But in about 10 years, in 1964, Japan will have a new standard rifle, was called the Type 64. We will go over in a separate episode about the weaponry in a separate episode, like I mentioned. Also, and at the same year, in 1965, 1 year after the adoption of the Type 64 rifle, Japan wanted to have their own olive green uniform for training purposes, normal infantry use, and for the other armed forces. But they also were looking at camouflage use uniform. And in 1965, the first camouflage as the camouflage Mark I was introduced. In the West it's called the Fang pattern. Why it's called that name, I'm not really sure. I don't have that information right now. If someone knows that, please let me know in the comment sections down below. The camouflage will be directly involved for dress service for the 1st Airborne Division. Also, the standard infantry, mechanized infantry units will getting also the camouflage, but the most important units will have the camouflage where soldiers were stationed at Hokkaido and was most closest to a possible invasion of the Soviet Union. So more soldiers were stationed there, same with the Americans. Fortunately, never came an invasion. The Soviet Union broke up in 1990. But of course, the webbing equipment and the camouflage were still in use at the time. The camouflage will be outdated and will be replaced in the early 1990s by new camouflage. That we'll go over in a separate episode. The webbing equipment is based on the Vietnam War era M56 variation. The first developed in 1956, of course, but the Japanese want to have their own variation and develop and make their own variation. It was maybe rubber products to prevent getting any problems with their webbing equipment. And also in 1966 they're making the Type 66 helmet, a direct copy of the M1 helmet from one fits all. But this helmet was a little bit more smaller for the normal Japanese soldier, and was more finer compared to the standard M1 helmet. Of course, the whole webbing equipment will be replaced by the new variation in the early 1990s, but I already have a video about Japanese flag tartan uniform. If you want to see that, click in the description box down below. This uniform is a really interesting uniform. It was the first officially uniform made in Japan itself. I have this model myself in my collection, but unfortunately I don't know how old it is, which year it was developed, but what I do know that this camouflage was used by a Japanese soldier was at a Ranger Battalion, 2nd Lieutenant at 10th Regiment 4CO. His name I cannot pronounce correctly. I leave it in the comment sections down below. If someone is watching this and you know this person, please let me know in the comment section down below, because it is really interesting to have anything original from the Japanese Self-Defense Force at the time. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Please let me know in the comment section down below what you think about this kind of uniform, and what do you know about it. Was it a good design, and would be perhaps maybe a better design compared to the ARDL uniform that the Americans use at the same time. Thank you for watching. Click that bell notification button down below and subscribe. See you next time.